There are no facts, only interpretations. This is a direct quote from Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most influential philosophers of the 19th century. It's from one of his many novels, Twilight of the Idols. It's fairly frank in its messaging. An event or intention's interpretation is defined by the people interpreting. Two people can taste, see, and think two completely different ways about nearly everything. This is the fundamental building block of disagreements. But what happens when acting on those disagreements could be considered harassment? VRChat is a relatively new technology, and by that nature, there are many questions that ethically haven't been defined with an answer in the cultural zeitgeist. The one I'd like to focus on is the notion of consent and sexual harassment within a digital space. This issue has two main camps. One that denies the notion that consent is expected when touching another person in a virtual space, and another who feels that consent should be expected when touching another person in a virtual space. We have our splitting factor, so now I'll illustrate both sides in more detail. For the pro free touch people, a big part of the philosophy is based on the fact that virtual personas are simply not physical. The person cannot feel what they are doing, therefore, what they are doing is ethical. They also believe the ability to escape what they were doing somehow absolves them of possible wrongdoing, with that having the underlying belief that people have a responsibility to fend off bad actors for themselves. On the other side, we have the pro consent camp. They believe that our virtual personas represent ourselves beyond a virtual way and expect to be treated as such. Many in this camp will argue that phantom sense, definition here, makes them feel what's happening to them in VR physically, therefore touching them as a real effect. I'll get more into that later. It may be slightly obvious, but I'm very biased to the pro consent side, as most people should. There have been many cases where I've seen people, usually men, going up and groping a feminine or female avatar. When noticed, the pilot of the feminine avatar is uncomfortable or mad, and the gropers use the excuse that they're virtual, arguing the aphysicality of an avatar makes sexually harassing them okay. In this video, I'll be providing an argument for the pro-consent side of this debate, using examples I've seen in my time on VRChat to prove that you can virtually sexually harass someone. With that out of the way, I will start. I'd like to bring up a basic thought experiment. One of the theoretical physicist's favorites, Schrodinger's cat. I'll be modifying it to fit the scenario. You walk up to a box labeled 50-50, might be a cat in here, might not. You pick up the box. Is it ethical to start violently shaking the box? I think the answer is fairly obvious. If you have the chance of harming something or someone for no reason, there's no ethical reason to do it. There is no threat that causes sexual harassment within virtual spaces, meaning there is no real reason to do it. What escalates this to sexual harassment is simple: haptics. Haptic technology is a way to feel what happens to you in VR, usually vibrating motors to stimulate the feeling of touch. This completely makes the opposition's arguments fall apart. We have now defined a real effect on these people via the haptics, meaning any argument that claims simple virtuality is an excuse flies out the window. Instead of a box that said 50-50, might be a cat in here, imagine a button that said 199, you might sexually harass someone. The answer is pretty obvious. Despite that, these people inappropriately touch players without asking, with the possibility of physically impacting the other player. Thus, consent is important in VR. As for phantom sense, I would be arguing about how that factors into this. Some swear by it, others think it's nonsense, and I lie somewhere in the middle. There are multiple scientific studies indicating that non-existent limbs can be felt. Ooh, that's a name. Ramachandran's mirror box experiment comes to mind. So it's not impossible to think that people could feel virtual stimuli in the real world. While I won't make the straw man argument that people on the other side always believe, I will say there is a significant correlation I've noticed between those who believe consent is necessary and people who don't believe phantom sense exists at all. When you examine the types of people who say these things, you'll find a pattern. They often believe that there is no social obligation to be decent, simply an obligation to block those who are not. This argument is flat nonsense because its intentions are open to anyone of a microwave's IQ. The philosophy gives them an excuse to point to, allowing themselves to be intentionally rude or irritating, then blaming the victims for not protecting themselves from them. As if, perhaps, these people believe consent is something they are obligated to have by default. There's a sickness in VR that we've all seen. These people take no accountability for their actions while terrorizing the people around them. Realistically, many of these people aren't looking for a logical argument against their actions. They are often doing what they do out of a sadistic entertainment, out of the suffering of others, or a selfishness to not care what others feel. I believe that people in VRChat, as a culture, need to be more vocal about these facts, these arguments I've presented here today. Sexually harassing people, VR or not, should not be a silly thing that people giggle about. People should be allowed to enjoy spaces without having people tugging at their breasts, which is kind of shocking, I have to say. I'll use this time at the end to remind you all to always remember the importance of consent, the importance of letting people feel protected in an environment, virtual or not. Have a good day.